The interesting thing about that, and I agree with you. There's a very delicate balance there. And the one thing I kind of thought about, or one thing that got me thinking about this more, because I've had a more of a moderate stance, or I guess you say like a non-absolutist stance for pretty much the entirety of, I'm just not that controversial of a person in general. So it's like I'm not really probably gonna like gravitate towards the, all right, let's make this big wow statement that is going to polarize things, because it's probably not the environment that I prefer to be in myself. So like I've tended to kind of have a little bit more of a moderate explanation when asked about it. And the thing that I find interesting about that is when you do get into just like the conversation online, like you said, there is that like there's that initial like that if you finesse it in, I think you have this situation where people who are already curious, they're gonna be able to sort of like weed through some of that and be like, okay, that's a little extreme. Like sugar isn't inherently going to just kill you if you even look at it, which is an extreme example of an extreme example, I guess. But they're gonna kind of know how to navigate that versus the person who's completely unfamiliar with the approach to a large degree, and their first impression is coming from the counter where they say all these low carb keto carnivore folks are so deranged. They say this, that, and the other thing, and that person's like, well, I'm not even gonna attempt to engage to get that tiny bit of curiosity that would help them navigate that a little bit better. So in my mind, I'm thinking like if I just took inventory about my own rhetoric over the years, it's going to be very positive towards low carbohydrate diet. And I also kind of appreciate like in order to kind of have that moderate stance, I probably need to share also the potential downsides of the approach or where it could potentially go wrong. Or the way I talk to my coaching clients is like we need to look at this with through a lens of there are going to be some positives to this. There's going to be some things where it's like, oh, this would be a great input for you, but that may come at the consequence of something else. So we need to balance those, whether that new input is going to be a net positive as a whole versus looking at it as like, let's get your fat oxidation rates as high as we possibly can and ignore any potential downsides to that. Where is that kind of balance where, you know, if we're looking at performance versus just health and longevity, you know, all that sort of stuff. So to me, I kind of thought of what I sort of consider too is just like what on average I'm putting out there in terms of if someone thinks about like me as someone who communicates for this, am I too one-sided or am I giving enough like, well, here's the downside, or here's where the rhetoric around low carbohydrate really does fail to actually do good things. I think there's a balance there too, where if someone sees me as like, well, Zach is willing to push back on some of the absolutist claims, or he's able to appreciate that someone may actually find success with a moderate carbohydrate diet, then if I come to him with a question, he's going to give me the honest answer versus just try to guide me to the direction he wants me to go or wherever his preferences go. Does that kind of make sense?
Absolutely. And I agree entirely. The annoying thing that I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about is to no matter how hard you try to take that approach, and I do as well, because you're going to be associated with a particular diet group, the taint of those who are extreme is going to rub off on you, such that those who don't spend enough time with you will take those generally pro low carb things you do say, because I mean, that's probably where you lean, like where I lean,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of track it towards the more extreme view. And the things that you say that are pushbacks, like here's some positive things about fruit, which I'll say every now and then, or positive things about fiber, those kind of like disappear and don't get amplified, you
Mm-hmm.
know? So just by virtue of what gets amplified by your own party and by what, or perceived party, I should say, and by what they're saying, it changes the lens through which what you say is said, and to be mindful about that as well is like a whole nother level of problem. It's not one you can't really. It's I don't even know that it's that addressable,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just one to consider.
There's a certain number of uncontrollables that you're just not going to really be able to do much about. And then the question just becomes how much time and energy and potential conflict do you create by trying to address those versus just kind of trudging forward on the path you find to be the best path and sort of ignore. And I mean, I think like what generated this podcast was like essentially that, right? Where like I made a post on Twitter. Are we able to call it X yet with people understanding what we're saying, or is it just better to
We
call it?
can. It's weird. I think the thing that's preventing X from taking on is it's not a verb.
Oh
I
yeah,
say I'm going to X, but then I can't say I'm going to send an X.
yeah, yeah,
I'm going to tweet. And so because I keep saying I'm going to tweet, it just bleeds back over into Twitter.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
It
Because there's
does.
no verb version. I
Mm-hmm.
think X will take off when there's a verb
Yeah, that's a
for
good
the
point.
action of Xing.
I hadn't thought of that. So yeah, Elon needs to get to that marketing
Yeah,
campaign.
I didn't think about that branding element,
hmm
but
But anyway,
yeah, you were gonna
yeah, to the
transition
point,
to
like there was
statement.
I created a bit of a stir, I guess, because I went on Twitter/X and I made a post where it was kind of like impulsive to a degree where I had been thinking about all these things we've talked about so far. And then I was just having a conversation with someone and they shared with me, like, I don't spend a lot of time on the American Dietetics Association's website for probably obvious reasons, but like I was in this conversation
Diabetics.
and they, or dietetics, I'm sorry. Um, and they sent me this link of like, oh, here is their actual low carb or very low carb position and statement and resources. And I wasn't actually aware that that was there. So I was thinking about that. I was like, well, here's an opportunity to say, okay, here's an organization where I would imagine the majority of low carbohydrate ketogenic followers and advocates would be, they're not happy with the ADA in the sense that they think one of two things, I would say. They would think either that the ADA is not doing enough, where they should be pushing more of a low carb ketogenic lifestyle, or at least giving more opportunities for people to come across that side of their option table. And then there's the people who think they should just totally turn ship and be advocating nothing but ketogenic low carbohydrate diets. And I tend to fall in the former where I think, yeah, I think the ADA probably could benefit from increasing the visibility of low carb ketogenic diets. I'm not 100% sure as to whether that's a situation of their threshold of we need to hit this level of science and rigor before we start doing that versus mine. My threshold's probably lower given that I prefer that way of eating. So I try to think about it like that. If I stepped away and I was totally neutral in the topic in the sense that I ate just whatever I wanted, would I look at this as, is there enough scientific research towards low carbohydrate ketogenic diets being something that we should move from a backseat option to here's our primary stance and anything else comes secondary to this. So you try this first. And if that fails, then we move to these other options. But generally speaking, the post was basically to highlight the ADA does have some of these options. So if someone tells you it's totally against it, here is a statement that suggests they aren't against it. They may not do a good job of marketing it. I didn't say that. So maybe that would have been a better post where I'd been like, if I would have added to that, I guess if I could go back and do it all over again, I would have posted the same thing I did. But at the end, I would have said, now they may not do a great job of marketing this, and hopefully that's something they improve upon. But there is no like complete absent of it was more or less where I was getting at with that post. And that I think probably stirred up a few more of the absolute side of low carb ketogenic online. And they looked at it as this is and they look at it as any defense of the ADA is like a sign off. They've done everything they need to do, carry on type of messaging. And so it kind of spirals from there where like now it gets off topic into other things and stuff like that. And then it just becomes like, your typical online back and forth, like sidebar topics, things that aren't necessarily like relevant to the initial post. And then, I mean, I don't have to explain to you how it goes, but